So you're at the seaside and you would like to do a long exposure of the sea to try and flatten the sea out a bit. But you don't have a tripod with you, or maybe you don't own a tripod, or perhaps it's just too windy to put a tripod up, which was the case when I took this photo. So if we look at the original image for this, the original image or images look like these, and these were a series of photos that I took to try and capture this pier curving out. And when I was there, I thought, well, actually I could probably turn this into a figure number two, but I really wanted to get a long exposure for this. The problem was that it was blowing a hoolie up there. The winds were coming in from my right and in front of me, and they were probably blowing 40, maybe 45 miles an hour. So there's no way I could put a tripod up. So what I want to do is I want to show you how you can combine multiple exposures, even handheld, which all of these were. These are all handheld. These were shot at 1/800th of a second at 104 millimeters. So I was using a long focal length on my camera, and as I say, it was handheld, which is why you notice the horizon is all over the place. So what I want to do is I want to show you how you can combine these images into a final photo, which ultimately looked like this after I toned it a bit. So the way to do this is we're going to select a number of these photos. Let's go and find some of these that I want to select, and we'll go as far as there. So I've selected 23 images, and what I would now do, normally I'm starting in Lightroom, but you don't need to start in Lightroom. You can always start this off in Photoshop or in Bridge or whatever. So I've toned all the images, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to right click on one of these images, and we'll choose edit or open as layers in Photoshop. Now if you're not using Lightroom, what you want to do is to get one document with all of these individual photos as separate layers in there. So we're just going to choose open as layers in Photoshop. This may take a little while. Okay, now we've got all of these layers in Photoshop. What I need to do first is, because these were shot handheld and all the horizons all over the place, and you'll find some of the composition don't line up correctly. What we need to do is we need to align these layers. So to do that, I'm going to go to select all layers, and then we go to edit and auto align layers. 99% of the time you can just choose auto. It's not likely that you'll ever come across using any of these other ones, but so just leave it on auto and you'll probably be fine. So we'll just click on OK on that, and then what Photoshop will do is it will analyze each of those layers and it will line them up according to the prominent feature, which in this case of course is the pier and the lighthouse. Okay, so this has aligned all of the images. As you can see, we have a certain amount of empty space on here. So what we really want to do is we want to crop this. So we'll just select the crop tool and crop tool, thank you. And so we're just clicking here, and then we're just going to crop this in to what will ultimately be our finished composition. And obviously we need to rotate it because the horizon isn't level, but let's just give ourselves a bit of working space first, and then we can just rotate that round to get that horizon level, something like that. That should do. And we'll just adjust this crop so we get the beach coming out of the corner. Now obviously we haven't averaged out any of these images yet, which is exactly what we're going to do. So once we finish, the crop is finished, which will only take a moment. What we're going to do is we're just going to go on here. We can either right click on here and choose convert to smart objects, or we can go to layer, smart objects, convert to smart object. So what we're going to do is we're going to convert all of these layers into a smart object. Now it's important that you have all the layers selected. So again, before we do this, we'll just make sure we have select all layers, and then we'll go to layer, smart object, convert to smart object. This may take a moment or two. So here we have a smart object. Now it looks like all of the layers have gone missing, but in reality, of course, they haven't. They're all embedded within this single document. So what we need to do now is to actually try and find some way of flattening this thing out. And so to do this, what we're going to do is we go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and Mean. And what this is going to do, this is going to go through the image pixel by pixel and working out what the average color is. So it's going to take the color value for every pixel off every layer, and then take an average and create the or set the color to that average value. So let's just click on that, and we'll click on Mean. Okay, so now you can see what's happened is the sea has now flattened out. What was rough before now looks much flatter. It looks like we were using a long exposure to take this shot, even though in fact it isn't. It's a series of 23 images shot at 1/800th of a second, combined together to produce this final photo. The last thing I would do here would be to select Layer, Flatten Image, so we don't have to deal with a huge file. Because the layers are still embedded in the smart object, if you save this out, the file size is actually going to be huge, and so this will actually just compresses everything. And then from here we can then go into this, and then we can then start doing other tweaks on this as we might wish. So that's how I produced my version. Obviously put a moon in there and so forth, but if essentially that's what you would do. So what else might you want to use this technique on? Well, this is a waterfall. This is one of my favourite waterfalls in the UK. This is the Orchy Falls down Glen Orchy in Scotland, and you can see what I've done here is I've loaded up all of the a whole load of layers here. There's actually 50 layers in this stack, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through the same process. So we're going to align the layers. Well, in actual fact, this was taken on a tripod, so aligning the layers I don't actually need to do, but we're going to combine these into a smart object, and then we'll just change the stack mode to mean, and we'll average out this waterfall. So let's do this. So let's go to Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Objects. Okay, so it's converted all of these 50 odd layers into a smart object, and then of course the next thing we do is we go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and Mean. And there you are. It's taken all of those 50 images and it's produced this photo as though we just put an ND filter onto the camera and just took a long exposure. Each of the individual images was about 1/10 of a second. So if we've combined 50 of those images, then it's effectively simulating a 5-second exposure. It's not quite the same because obviously we've got gaps in there between taking each individual photograph, so it's not quite a 5-second exposure, but the effect is still not bad. Do I prefer this to the original photo? Some bits of it I do, some bits of it I don't. I think in here it's not quite as good. In this area around there it's not as good, but I do like the effects over here and in here and down in there. So it's not quite as good as the original. I think on balance I prefer the original 1/10 of a second exposure time. But of course what I could always do, this is 50 photos, I could actually take less than 50 photos. I could have taken just, I don't know, 10 of them, for example, and combined them and got perhaps what might be a more pleasing photograph. Of course, if you're using Photoshop Elements, you can't do the technique I've just shown you, because that relies heavily on using smart objects in Photoshop. But there is a trick that we can do inside Elements, and that trick is to play around with the opacity. So I've got 8 layers in here. You'll find that this works best if you can group your photos into documents of no more than 8 layers, and you'll see why when we go through adjusting the opacity. So my bottom layer, this is my base layer, I need to keep my opacity at 100%. The next layer up, I'm going to reduce that to 50%, as I've done there. The one above that goes to 25%. The one above that goes to 13%. The one above that one goes to 6%. This one will go to 3%. This one will go to 2%. And this one will go to 1%. And you can see that once we complete that last layer, we've actually been able to smooth this water out. And so if you had, in my case, 50 photos, you'd have to repeat this process another 7 times by creating a document with the next 8 photos you're going to use as layers, and so on. And then once you've got those 7 documents finished, then you combine those 7 documents in the same way by choosing one of them as being your base layer, and then you just add the other photos as layers, adjusting the opacity each time. And that way you can then end up with a photograph that looks something similar to the one that I showed you inside Photoshop. So that's how you would do that inside Photoshop Elements. Now I hope you found this useful. Of course, when you're taking these photos, particularly up in Scotland, and you're not up there on its calm day, it's probably going to be blowing a bit of a breeze, and you may decide you don't actually want to show any blurred trees, because if you're doing a long exposure, the trees are going to be moving as well. So one thing you can do about this is to add a mask to all of your layers. So here I've added a mask. Let's just have a look at this one. And I've masked out pretty much everything except the water. These are the only parts of the finished photo that I want to actually blend. Now I've not been particularly accurate with this mask. I don't need to be accurate with it because, you know, where these rocks are, well, the rocks aren't moving, so they're going to average out and be in the same position anyway. So I've just done a quick masked out some of these features that I just don't want to average out. In particular, I don't want to average out the sky. The sky is pretty interesting as it is, and I don't really want to lose that detail up there. So this is one thing that doing this technique you can do that you can't do if you just do a normal long exposure. If I just put on a normal exposure of 5 seconds, the sky up here would become quite, you'd go a bit streaky, and you'd lose some of that interest up there. So this way is a way that you can actually do this. Even if you're on a tripod, you may want to do this just to keep that interest in the sky. But you do exactly the same thing. You select all of the layers, you go to Layer, Smart Objects, Convert to Smart Objects. Now we have this as a smart object, we can go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, Mean. And this will convert these layers into the finished article. And there you have it. We've averaged out the water to make that look like a long exposure, but the sky has remained as it was in the first image. So that way we can actually maintain interest in one part of the image and blur another one. So for example, if you were doing a crowd scene somewhere, I don't know, a station or a square or something like that, and you might want to have one person or a couple or a group of people to be fairly stationary in the scene, but you want to blur everybody else, maybe even remove them. Well, by taking a whole series of photos, you can put a mask on all but one of the images to mask out the person or the group of people that you want to remain static. And then you do this process and you'll blur all of the other people, but your main subject will remain sharp and stationary. So I hope you found that useful. It's an interesting little technique. It's something I've been planning to talk about for about 4 or 5 years and just never got around to it. So there you go.